Ladies and gentlemen, today in War Thunder we're looking at the Ki-61-I Ko Hien. It's a tier 2 Japanese fighter here on the tech tree if it just comes up just after the Hayabusa and just before the other Ki-61s. It has a BR of 2.7 in arcade and I believe the same in realistic, yes it does. And to be honest, it's quite a nice little nifty fighter. And to be honest, when we look at the other fighters you can get around its BR, you're looking at the Zeros, the A6M2-N, and even stuff like the heavy fighters, the Ki-45s. You have the Ko, the Otsu, and the Tai, and in my opinion, the Ki-61 trumps them all. Looking at customization and stuff, you only really get this one skin, but I have seen some very nice user skins on the War Thunder Live community part, so if you want to have a look around there, they are quite nice. But the one that you get in game is the 3rd Chutai 68th Sentai Camouflage, and it's alright, you know? I mean, there's nothing special about it. It looks very Japanese, but it is alright. Looking at its weaponry, you've got two 12.7 Ho 103 machine guns and two 7.7, so nothing that... There's no cannons, basically, but it can still pack a punch. And looking at the lineup you can take in arcade, you're not really... If you're using this, you're not really worried about weaponry, because you can also take the Ki-45s with the 20mm, and even the Otsu with the 37. So, overall, it's quite a nice, nifty fighter. So let's get into some arcade battles. So here we are in arcade battles. I have two for you today, but to be honest they're quite short, but I think they illustrate how I like to use this thing, the Ki-61. Basically, when you look at the Japanese overall with their planes, the way I see it in arcade is that the Zeros are for turn fighting, and the Ki-61s are more of your energy fighters, but they're still good at the whole turning thing, but not as good as the Zero. So I like to use this thing as a bomber hunter, even though it doesn't have, you know, your amazing cannons or anything. It has some very good ammo and still very good guns because of their rate of fire. Recently in War Thunder, 12.7s and 7.7s have basically had a resurgence because of the recent patch, which basically made all guns supposedly better, but there was definitely a massive influence with the 7.7s, which means that bomber hunting with these caliber of guns is actually possible now. So instead of going into the furball at the bottom, what I like to do, even in a domination, is get some height, usually about 4,000 meters, and basically go after the bombers. Usually around this level, you've got to remember this thing has a BR of 2.7. You're going to come up against G4M1s, Beauforts, Blenheims, BF110s, the early Heinkels, the HE111, H3, so you're not going to come up against anything that tough. And to be honest, your guns are good enough, as you saw there. One hit, there he goes. It's kind of as simple as that. I mean, you don't really have to put too many shots into things to set them on fire anymore. And with these stealth belts that I like to use, because I'm basically used to the trajectory of the ammunition in this plane, and when it's fired, basically I've got the muzzle velocity of the guns down to a pretty good, accurate thing that I can do, basically. I don't know how to word that. But as you can see, we tore apart the G4M1. Going after this Hurricane now, we can plant shot after shot. He has no idea I'm here. Slightly dodge him, and then get away. We will get into the damage model of this thing in the video afterwards, because I think there's a massive problem with it. But anyway, you can easily regain your energy in this thing. Energy retention is very good in this. Even for a Japanese plane at this level, its engine is not bad. Like, it is actually able to put power through it in arcade, in realistic as well, but since we're in the arcade section, let's talk about that. Once again, go for a head-to-head, slightly dodge that H6K, and so far I've taken a few hits and they've done no damage, which is nice. It seems like with this thing, you can take a decent amount of hits, but once something gets critical, kind of like with the Thunderbolts, it becomes quite hard to fly, or maybe when it becomes imbalanced, basically, when you have one black wing and one not black wing. But using the guns with their decent rate of fire, we can plonk shot after shot after shot. Obviously, looking at cruise skills with this thing, it would be good to up your weapons maintenance, because the rate of fire on these guns is very high, so they are going to overheat quite quickly. But as you can see, since my crew on this thing is pretty highly skilled, and we can basically show that you can plonk a ton of ammunition into one plane. So after going after bombers, they finally realise that diving is the best option, but we are also getting absolutely smacked in this game. That's the problem with one-zone dominations, to be quite honest. Once one team gets the overall capture, it's quite hard to get it back, or even sway the tide of the game. One of the issues I have with ground forces, to be quite honest, when they have a similar system. But all we can do is soldier on. The Ki-61 is definitely not a brawler, so going after the airfield is not always a good idea. But doing stuff like this, going very fast, coming down on this Wellington, is a good idea. So we get some sparks, we get some hits, don't do anything really critical. But we can keep going. As I said, this thing retains its energy very well for quite a low tier fighter. The fact that its BR is 2.7, I'd say that compared to stuff with a BR of 5, it's obviously not going to compete. But at this level, when you compare it to Spitfires, Hurricanes, even the Hayabusa, it is a hell of a lot better than them when it comes to energy retention. Turning wise, not so much. A lot of the times I end up using my landing flaps instead of my combat flaps to turn this thing, and the problem with that is the elevator seems to go to sleep when you start using it. So you've got to keep that in mind when you were doing that. But we won't be able to outturn a Spitfire, so it's better to attack him when he's in the defensive. But as we can see, because we basically lost that in the first few minutes of the battle, since they took the airfield first, that doesn't mean that we didn't do well. I mean, 3 kills in the space of, how long was that, maybe 5 or 6 minutes? It's not bad when it comes down to it in the Ki-61. A lot of people will say, well, why not use a 0 in this situation? And what I would say is, fair enough, I agree with you. The thing about the 0 is it has better armament, 20mm obviously, and we're comparing the A6M2N here because they basically have the same BR with the Ki-61. But with the A6M2N, you are limited in what you can do. You basically have to turn fight. It's very hard to keep your energy up in that thing or get it in the first place. With this Ki-61, you can climb very well, you obviously have WEP as well, and you can retain your energy over time, which is a big thing for a lot of pilots. Not everybody is a turn fighter. Some people love to energy fight, love to boom and zoom, and even in arcade, you are able to do that. So this is the second map battle, and it isn't a domination, it is a ground strike, which is quite nice. That means that there's going to be a lot of juicy bombers on the other team. And when you look around this BR, there are other bombers that you can come up against in the Ki-61, apart from the ones I listed, stuff like the Ju-87, the Ju-88, even stuff like the A-20G, I suppose, when you think about it, the SBD Dauntless, everything like that. All those early tier 2 planes, or late tier 1s, you're not really going to come up against many tier 3s, unless they're American, and you can deal with them, because you can outclimb them, and you can outturn them, so there you go. So here we're picking targets. There's a Ju-87 or a Ju-88. The only reason not to go for the Ju-87 is if it's the D variant with the 20mm, but I realise it isn't, so it's only got 2 7.7 staring in my direction. So why not go for a head-to-head? I would probably say it's a bad idea to go head-to-head in this plane, but because this Ju-87 only has 2 7.7s, I'm not too worried about it. So we take minimal hits, set him on fire and kill him, but as we see, our engine is red, and that is why you don't really want to go head-to-head in this, or really any Japanese plane, because they are fragile. The engines do fall apart from a few hits. I believe that guy hit me maybe 4 times at most with 7.7s, and my engine is basically crippled. I'm leaking coolant, and if I was clever, which at the moment in this battle I'm not, I would go back to base, but instead, let's bomber hunt. The Ju-88 is looking juicy. So, might as well go for him. We are faster than him, even with a crippled engine. We have WEP if we need to, and he's not deciding to dive. He's actually trying to man up and beast mode against me and this I-16. But unfortunately for him, the I-16 has other plans. Let's just say he has some rockets, and there goes the Ju-88. But once again, the enemy team gets basically wise to our ideas and they start diving, which is usually how it happens in this game in arcade. And the Ki-61, it means that you can use its beautiful energy fighting and boom and zooming to great effect, meaning that you can't dive as fast as these bombers because obviously, good old F equals MA, but they will eventually catch them, and because you retain speed and energy better than stuff like Wellingtons in a turn and everything like that, you will be able to eventually get them. So here we are. Here is the Wellington, which unfortunately causes my demise at the end. We get a few hits into him, nothing critical. As we can see, my aim is a bit off there, but we just swoop up, turn over, and there he is right there. Even in that loop, we can easily keep up with him being a Wellington with supposedly a fixed flight model in the last patch. But this is where we need to look at. So I set him on fire, move, and bang. So my wing fell off, and as I said before, this thing kind of has a dodgy damage model when it comes to collisions. So let's slow that down. Here we go. Coming in. And I didn't touch the wing. So if we just freeze frame it in the moment I pass the Wellington, as we can see, well, let's just say the hitbox for the wing and everything else is just slightly a bit large, but that's a thing on the side, I'd say. Overall, this thing is good in arcade. I would definitely recommend it over the Zero. But anyway, let's get on to some performance testing. So here we are in the performance testing part of the review for the Ki-61-I Ko Hien. And as you can see, I have a full tank of gas, and basically we're going to see how far we can push this thing until its engine overheats. The way I'm going to do that is by wepping it, and basically climbing and seeing how high I can get, trying to stay at an optimal speed compared to the degree that I climb at. Now, for me, in the Ki-61, I believe from 0 to 2,000 meters, the best angle of climb with WEP is 20 degrees. It seems to work well, and you can maintain a decent speed, so if you get caught out, you can still level out and accelerate very quickly to combat speed, or what I would see as it. Then, from 2,000 to 4,000, you're looking at 15 degrees, or if you want to be a bit cheeky, maybe 16 or 17, but 15 degrees is your safe bet. And then above that, 10 to 15 degrees, mainly towards the 10 degrees part, because at that point, if you're in a realistic battle, you are going to be getting to combat, so you want to have more speed, really, than altitude at that point. I mean, when it comes down to it, the closer you get to combat, the more energy you want, especially in something like an energy fighter like the Ki-61. So while we are climbing and having a look around, let's get into some of the stats on this thing. Modifications wise, it's actually quite easy to unlock everything. It isn't like a lot of planes where there's a ton of modifications like the BF-109G6, where basically they just throw stuff at you. For this, your main upgrades, in my opinion, are obviously going to be stuff like the engine and the engine injection. That really gives you that extra power in rate of climb. And by the way, the stat card for this thing is completely wrong, so do not listen to it. But another thing to take into account is with the weaponry. Getting the belts unlocked really makes these guns very effective. I mean, when you look at the tracer ammo for the offensive 12.7mm, which you have too, you basically fill your ammo rack with, well, basically mines. I mean, you're looking at armor-piercing incendiary tracer bullets. And for realistic and arcade, that's basically all you want. I mean, in arcade I use stealth, because it's armor-piercing incendiary and immediate action incendiary, so you're going to get a lot more fires, and it's going to look a lot nicer, and it's going to do more damage over time. But with the tracer belts, and the air target belts, and the universal belts, they are all brilliant belts. You're going to get some very, very good results. When we go onto the offensive 7.7, The tracer ammo is pretty much useless. The stealth ammo is probably the best, but if you're not okay with using stealth, I would go for universal, just because you get that adjustment incendiary bullet as well, not just the armor-piercing bullet. It is very useful. So going back to weaponry, like I said, this thing has two 7.7s and two 12.7s. And people may count that out. But when you actually fly this thing, you realise that the rate of fire of the guns is very, very good. You fire your ammunition very quickly, and because you have a lot of rounds of it, then you don't run out very fast. I mean, you have 800 of each, so basically you have 800 shots through your 7.7, so 400 per gun, and then 800 through your 12.7, so once again 400 per gun. Now for me, overall, I've never had an issue with this thing overheating, but as I said in the arcade part, that may be down to the fact of the crew on this thing. One of the main things I go for is weapon maintenance and vitality when it comes to crew points, and if I look at it now, when we go to ground service, my weapon maintenance is 70 out of 100 when it comes to this plane, so that may be a factor. But because you're not firing higher calibers, they shouldn't overheat very quickly, so you should be able to at least sustain fire for a decent amount of time, and also without running out of ammunition. When we look at the fuel loads of this thing though, I was quite surprised to see that you weren't able to take 20 minutes, because that seems to be the standard between a lot of planes right now. You can take 30, 45, an hour, and an hour and 21. We're using the hour and 21 in the climbing, basically. But overall, I would say there's no reason to take more than 30 minutes, because 30 minutes, that basically means in a realistic battle you'll have to go and refuel once if you're using your plane to the best of its ability, and by that point you will have to reload, you may have to repair, and all of these things. So you might as well take 30 minutes. 45 is a bit too long and does slow you down a bit. This thing is an energy fighter, so getting up to speed can be a problem. Obviously, with extra fuel, that does mean extra weight. So in a dive you will be slightly better, but retaining that energy, which is one of this thing's massive strong points, you kind of lose when you start adding weight to it. Unfortunately, there are no bombs for this thing, even though in my opinion I think they should, since this thing seemed to have them in real life. There are no secondary weapons at all, even though it was kind of designed for them in a way. So you are stuck with your armaments. If you're looking for this thing to take out tanks or to take out ground targets, which are heavier than armoured cars, you are unfortunately not in luck. Heavy tanks and medium tanks you won't be able to take out. Bridges you won't be able to take out. Pillboxes, I don't know. I've heard different stories about 12.7s being able to take out pillboxes. I know that 50 cals can, but I'm pretty sure these Japanese 12.7s can't, unless you just fill it full of armor piercing. But that's something I'll have to test at some point. I probably will do a video where I show every bullet hitting a pillbox, because I'm sick of people telling me one thing and then somebody telling me a different thing. It's very annoying, but to all intents of knowledge of mine, the Ki-61 cannot do that. It obviously can't destroy destroyers. It cannot kill cargo ships. It can kill transport and landing craft, I suppose. That's a plus. But this is obviously designed in game to be a fighter to fight fighters. There is no real point in going after ground targets. A lot of people may say that with this, you compare it to the 20mm to the 12.7s on a Zero. I would actually take this plane, but the 12.7s, they give you more ammunition, they have a better rate of fire, and they seem to do more damage right now. So in performance wise, I'd say this thing is more combat effective than a Zero, mainly because of how it flies, but once again that may be down to my playstyle. I am much more favoured when it comes to energy fighting over turn fighting, because that's just what I enjoy doing. I like going to high altitudes, I like getting a lot of speed, and I like trying to beat my opponent that way instead of trying to beat him in the horizontal, I'd try and beat him in the vertical. It's kind of as simple as that. But as we can see, the water of the engine is overheating, but the oil is actually decreasing. It got 75, and since we are climbing, it is now going down again. But with the water, it overheats at 122 degrees Celsius at 7 minutes 56 seconds at an altitude of 6,958 meters. So that basically means that this thing is wonderful when it comes to trying to get altitude. And cooling it down was very easy to do, even the oil decreased as well. So that's always nice to see with something like that. As you can see, I'm firing a few tracers off and stuff just to show how the guns work. You do have guns mounted on the wings, so remember about convergence, but you do also have nose guns just to sort that out. Combat flaps out, let's get into a dive and see how this thing does. Its combat flap brakes at 720 kilometers an hour, and its wings brake at 780. But the weird thing is the combat flap on the left wing does not brake until the right wing brakes, weirdly enough. And I don't really know why that is. It may be a bug in the game, or it just may be because that's how I was diving in this thing. But there you go, as you saw, the combat flap fell off, and then the wing, I believe, falls off before the combat flap. Yes, it does. But anyway, let's get on to some historical fact-finding. And so, onto the historical fact-finding part of this review for the Ki-61. It's quite an interesting plane when you look at its history. It basically was introduced in 1942, but prototypes overall were made as early as 1939 when it came down to it. It was basically designed by Takeo Doi, I believe, or Doi, and his deputy Shin Owada. And it was made in late 1939, basically as a response to Koku Honbu, who created this thing called a tender. And it was basically requested that two fighters were made for different combat roles. So what Takeo and Shin did is that they made the Ki-60, which we may see in game at some point, and the Ki-61. Now the Ki-60 was designed as a heavily armed interceptor, basically to take out bombers and such, so therefore it was designed with a very high wing loading. And then the Ki-61, it was seen as more of a general purpose fighter, so kind of a jack of all trades. But it kind of, when it was first released, at least the version that we're looking at today, it basically filled that role really well. It had air superiority at low to medium altitudes, as a lot of the Japanese fighters had. And when it came down to it, when it was made, the Americans didn't actually realize it was a Japanese plane. They thought it was a German or an Italian Lend-Lease plane because it looked so different to everything else that the Japanese had. They were obviously very used to stuff like the Zero and even the D3A1 and the early versions of dive bombers like the B5N2 and things like that. And basically what happened was, when it was made, it was first a prototype obviously, and it first flew in 1941 as the Type 3 Fighter Model 1, and even though the pilots were enthusiastic and it had self-sealing fuel tanks, the upgraded armament and everything like that, there was a lot of skepticism around it because of the senior officers, because, well, they kind of fell into the problem that the Germans did as well, and a lot of the war nations, to be honest. They had got used to this idea of these lightweight aircraft and a lot of maneuverability and everything like that, because with like the Ki-43 and the Zeros and everything, that was basically what they were. So they were worried about changing tactics and everything like that. So a lot of criticism came on the Ki-61, even though it was proved to be pretty good when it came out. But eventually it got to the production line, basically in 1942, so it did take a while. And then it was first noted on the Operation Doolittle raid. It was first seen by the Americans, basically, because it tried to intercept the bombers on the Operation Doolittle raid, and they thought it was an Italian aircraft, weirdly enough, because it had basically what looked like an Italian design. So there's a little tidbit. It was very interesting how the Americans actually found it, but eventually they realized it was an actual fighter, and it was first codenamed Mike, because it was probably thought to be a German fighter, but then it got adopted the name Tony as a code word because it looked more like an Italian aircraft at the end of it. So, over its operational history, it did pretty well. Looking at the early variants, it actually caught the Americans off guard, because the Americans, a lot of their tactics when it came to fighting Japanese aircraft head-to-heads, basically what they would do is if they got into a weaker position, they would just dive away, and the Zeros could not follow them. But the Ki-61 was able to follow them, so that meant that General George Kenney, who was the Allied Air Force commander in the Southwest Pacific, he found his Kitty Hawks, his P-40s, were just completely outclassed and destroyed by the Ki-61s, or at least the early variants. So he basically said, look, we need P-38s here. We need them to counter these Ki-61s. So that prompted the Americans to be like, alright, screw it, let's do it. But the problem with the Ki-61 came with the problem that the Germans kind of had at the end of the war as well, was the fact that the Allied Bomber Command, the Allied Bomber Units, there was just too many of them. A lot of Ki-61s and Zeros and everything like that were actually destroyed on the ground because they couldn't get up to deal with the bomber threat. And that was a real issue when it came to Japan throughout the war, showing that the bombing campaign basically won, or at least shortened the war for the Americans quite significantly. But then, in 1944, just as an extra little bit, there was a special unit actually made from the 23rd Sentai group of Ki-61s, which basically their direct orders were to ram American bombers, mainly the B-29s. So, there you go. That's what they kind of were made for at the end of the war. Not tons of these were produced, to be honest, at least the early versions. When we actually look at the stats, in 1942, only 34 of these were really made, and the majority of that was November and December of 1942. Planned was 209 of them. So yeah, something really went wrong there. But then when we go to 1943, overall 710 of them were made. So as we progressed through the war, more and more were made until basically the end of 1944, where, well, it basically changed when it came down to it. So it wasn't really used that much in early war compared to the Zeros and stuff, mainly down to, as I was talking about before, how the commanders did not have faith in it. But when they realized how good it was and how it could actually deal with the enemy, then it was able to be given its chance, and proved itself. So, let's get on to some realistic battles. And here we are in a realistic battle, where basically we are facing some Americans and British. Now the Ki-61 obviously does not spawn on a carrier, which is nice. Most of the time you get an air spawn, basically like the Ki-43 and Ki-84 in the same line. Something to really note about this plane, which I think is very important and realistic, is that when it comes to nations, people believe there is a certain way to flying each nation. When people think about Japan, they think about turn fighters. They think about do not engage them at low altitudes, boom and zoom them, energy fights, stuff like that. But with the Ki-61, that kind of breaks the mold for it. So you can actually catch out players off guard massively when it comes to fighting it. The Ki-61 supplements the Zeros very well. The Zeros are very good at turning. They're very good at engaging in long, arduous battles near the ground, whereas the Ki-61 can be used basically as an energy fighter. Its rate of climb is very good, and it at least keeps up with the Americans. It probably doesn't climb as well as the Spitfires, but I haven't really tested it against them. But once you get into the battle in realistic, it is up to snuff, it is up to altitude. And even if you aren't at the same altitude, you still can at least turn. Like this thing, even though I would class it as an energy fighter and a boom and zoomer, it can still turn. It's not something that is useless when it comes to a turn fight. It's just the fact that Zeros are better at it. Another thing to notice about this is, as said in the historical fact finding, the Americans kind of struggled at this plane at the start, and because of its BR of 2.7, you are encountering early war American planes. You're looking at the P-40E Kitty Hawk, you're looking at the Corsair, stuff like that, and to be honest, they are still very good planes. But the Kitty Hawk is completely outclassed by the Ki-61. The Corsair, unless you're about 2,000 meters above this thing, there's not really much you can do unless he forces you down, and then maybe he'll be able to energy fight you. I did skip ahead there just because I had a bit of a recording issue, still working out all the kinks and everything with this new machine. It is absolutely wonderful, as you've probably seen throughout. It's basically been around 60 FPS, it basically makes the game a lot better, and it makes most games a lot better instead of playing it at 30, because you can be more precise, more accurate, and everything like that. But anyway, we've spotted our first target and getting a bit of a lag spike. I'm still trying to work out, as I said, optimizing the settings and everything on this. I think it is something to do with clouds, which is making it struggle a bit, but it only happens for maybe a few times, and that's about it. But we get some shots in with these wonderful 12.7s and 7.7mm. Doesn't really do a lot of damage, but at least we got some hits in. The air target belts or the universal belts, no matter what you really want to use on this thing, even tracer belts, you are going to do a lot of damage. The tracer belts, or the orange tracers, how everybody knows them, are absolutely wonderful. And I don't know what I'm doing here, to be quite honest. That was a horrible approach. You should never do that. I thought that I could basically get on him through a loop, but one of the main problems of the Ki-61 is the fact that its elevator is not very good. It's a criticism I have of basically all of the Ki-61s when it comes down to it. They seem to struggle in the elevator department, especially when your flaps are out. But I don't know why, because that really shouldn't affect it. But that's the way I seem to find it. I find that stuff like the Zeros and the rest of the Japanese aircraft do not suffer from it in realistic, but maybe I'm just used to them. But that Wellington is basically critically damaged. He did have a fire, it went out. He did have 2 fuel leaks, they both closed themselves up. He did have critical damage, so hopefully he can, well, just die, and there he goes. Basically he went too fast, ripped his wing. He probably had critical damage, so he couldn't pull out of it. But as you can see, we can use the energy that we gained from diving after him and basically put it straight into a climb. Try and convert some of that speed into height. Deal with this Hellcat, who has got a bit too... well, he's a bit too confident when it comes down to it, when you look at the fighters around him. So dealing with that Wellington, it was very easy to do in this thing. As a bomber hunter in realistic, this isn't too bad, but it's definitely more of a fighter-on-fighter thing, aircraft, because basically when you come up against Americans, as I said, they think you're a turn fighter, and I have no idea why. But the Ki-61, as just shown before, it is pretty good at diving. It can get up to a decent speed. It can also pull out of it. You do obviously have to be careful of that, but you do with every plane. The Americans, looking at the Corsair, can still outdive you, but stuff like the Kitty Hawk and possibly the Hellcat, I've never actually had a dive fight with a Hellcat. So at least with the Corsair will be able to get away. But you can just do this, you can stalk your enemy, you can be above them, let the Zeros attack them down low, and if it looks like they need a bit of help, you stick your nose down and you go and help them. A lot has been said also about the types of guns in the game right now. There's been a few patches trying to fix them, especially the German guns, and to be honest, it doesn't seem to have worked too well. But something that a lot of people have been talking about is the fact that the 7.7s, or at least the machine guns in general, like the 12.7s and the 7.7s, are doing more damage. Which is why you saw that Wellington get absolutely bombarded with a fire. It got bombarded with 2 fuel hits. It basically got critical damage. Same with this Hellcat. A few hits into it, on fire once again. Fires seem to be definitely something that is pretty rampant in the game. And there's another one, so that's 3 aircraft, 3 fires, and that's just kind of how it is with this thing, with its ammo type. I believe I'm using Universal, but probably looking at it, Tracer is the best idea, because, well, you're not going to come up against many things which are massively heavily armoured, and that incendiary really helps. Another thing to note is that the Ki-61 is very fast in a straight line. It's something that a lot of people neglect, but it also is very fast in a straight line, and getting up to that speed, it doesn't take that long. It is one of those planes which accelerates pretty well, even though it seems to have quite a weak engine. This Ki-61 isn't very heavy, or it doesn't seem to. It's obviously heavier than a Zero, because a Zero is very, very light. But when it comes down to it, I'm pretty sure this thing is quite light as well, compared to a lot of stuff it faces. I mean, you look at the Corsair and you just think, well, that must be quite heavy in itself, looking at its guns and its wing loading and everything like that. But another thing was that the Ki-61 was actually designed to carry very lightweight bombs. And when I mean very lightweight, I mean like 60 kilos, stuff that the B-7A2 starts with. And you can kind of see that happening with the Ki-61. And it would be quite interesting to see how this thing reacts with a higher fuel amount, if it rolls better or rolls worse, just to see how the wing loading goes. Because at quite high speeds, it does lose a lot of its maneuverability. It does lose a lot of its roll. It isn't one of those aircrafts which at high speeds maneuvers better. It's one of those aircrafts which it locks up, kind of like how the BF-109s fly. And because the elevator, for me, doesn't really do its job when it comes to a lot of things, like just pulling up for instance, I wouldn't even want to try it at high speeds. I think it would be a death trap. But it handles really well up to its max speed, and then around its max speed it really struggles. So that's just kind of an observation. But we can go around taking out AA with our wonderful guns, 4 machine guns, waiting for the enemy to show itself. And when we look back at this battle, we took out a Wellington with minimal effort, to be honest. I even screwed it up. Like, I was quite amazed that the Wellington pilot didn't get more shots into me with his gunners, because I basically looped around his plane, lost a lot of my energy, and tried to sit on his tail, which is a terrible way to approach any bomber, especially something like a Wellington or a B-17, which has those tail gunners. We took out a Hellcat in basic prime position. When you look at something like a Hellcat, what you want to do is try and drive it low, and then try and get your Zeros to deal with it, which is basically what was happening. And I was able to get into a position to dive on him, get a good hit in, and then leave. And that was where we saw the ammunition really coming into effect in setting him on fire and crippling him. And then we had a few pot shots at the AI, but AI is AI. They're in biplanes. I don't really see much is going on. Looking at the ammunition amount is obviously quite a large thing in realistic. You want to make sure that you have enough to take out a few planes, and 800 is definitely enough to absolutely crucify anything you're going to face. A lot of people will go, oh, this thing doesn't have cannons, I don't want to go anywhere near it. Well, with the recent issues that 20mm and 30mm have been having with hit detection, then I would even recommend something like this, just because it doesn't have the same issues. Its rate of fire is higher, it has more ammunition. You compare it to a Zero. Zero has 120 shots with 220mm, I believe, the A6M2N. I know the A6M2 in the Ryzen has it, so I'm guessing they're the same. And they are very low velocity. Whereas you compare it to the Ki-61 with its two 12.7s with 800 shots, 400 each, they are pretty much rapid fire, and it's very easy to tear apart stuff or set things on fire. at the moment, at least in this game. It seems like, I believe the last patch they did, or at least the last major patch, they introduced the new smoke for the fuel, which is absolutely wonderful. It looks beautiful. I love that. But they also seem to increase the number of fires you get. I've been set on fire so many times when it comes down to it, but it is easier to put them out, or it seems to. Or maybe because there's just more fires, you just realize how easy it is to put them out. Or at least it's easier as long as your wing doesn't get ripped off by a fire. But we go in for a landing here. Something to note about the Ki-61, it isn't front heavy. Like, the engine in itself is not that heavy, so landing is not really an issue. There are a few planes which are very, very nose heavy. We talk about the Bearcat, the Yak 3P, I believe, even something like a Tempest, which is very easy to nose over when you land. The Ki-61s do not have this problem, basically because it seems like a lot of the weight is in the center of the fuselage and not in the nose. So landing and stuff like that is quite easy to do. But, you know, it's it's always nice being more safe than sorry. So we land to repair and rearm, and, well, the enemy team has been blasted apart by the Japanese, which happens all too often at this level. With a BR of 2.7 in the Ki-61, you're always going to have friends such as the early A6Ms, the Ki-43s, and even the occasional B5N2 or Ki-49. And they're not bad planes. At this level, you don't get many people who are very good at energy fighting, or at least understand everything about it. So that's why a lot of people think that a lot of the American planes are under-tiered at this point. But I would look at something like the Kitty Hawk and think that is... it should be, you know, a bit lower. I mean, you're looking at 3.0, I believe. It should be about the same as a Ki-61. But anyway, going back to the point, you don't come up against a lot of competition which can counter you, unless they are returning pilots who are generals or commanders in the ranks. I mean, every so often you run across somebody who's about level 80 and they're flying a Hayabusa because it's overpowered, or a Corsair and using it really well, but most of the time you're not going to have a lot of issues because a lot of people try and tend to the idea of turn fighting at these lower levels, and it's weird to think that this is a low level. I mean, you're talking about a BR of 2.7, but recently I've been playing a lot with stuff which is 5.7 or 6.3, so for me it's actually been quite nice going down to these lower levels because you come up against players where it's more about skill than the plane. And the thing is, with the Ki-61, if you're skilled, you also have a very good plane. The only way you die in this thing is if you engage a Kitty Hawk in a turn fight and don't use your landing flaps, or somebody is diving on you and you don't recognize them. Basically, complacency, I believe is the word, where you're complacent and you don't realize something is happening when it is. But we do see the last guys in a Beaufort, I believe, if I'm seeing the screen correctly, and we just go towards him. Look at that lovely ship which has been absolutely destroyed. Something to realize as well, which I thought was quite a nice detail. On high or ultra or whatever I'm on, basically you can see the sparks when the explosions come in the flak. I think that looks really nice. But that last guy gets destroyed, and we don't really have to do anything else in this match. We just go around. And thank you to that other premium Corsair guy on our team, because, well, me and him basically took out the whole enemy team. He got 6 kills, and I got 3, I believe. So, yeah. It was a bit of a stomp when it came down to it, but it does show how skill plays a massive part, and also premium planes are... well, they're suspect when it comes to stuff like this. And because it was the first game of the day and first win of the day, it isn't as if I have cherry-picked this match. It was the first one that I recorded with this plane, so none of you can claim bias or anything like that. I just think this is a superior plane when it comes to facing things, unless you come up against stuff which has somehow got an altitude advantage on you, or you have decided to engage in turn fights, because that's really not where this thing's strength is. Leave that to the zeros. Use this thing to energy fight, and you will have an amazing time with it in realistic. So, let's get on to the final verdict. So here we are in the final verdict for the Ki-61-I Ko Hien, where I'll be discussing the strengths and weaknesses I believe this plane has. So let's get on to the strengths. This plane is able to go toe-to-toe with the early American energy fighters in an energy fight. This is something that can't be said about most planes. This may be one of the only examples which can actually deal with a Corsair and even a Kitty Hawk and a Hellcat and everything like that, and do it well. The armament is sufficient enough to take apart anything you will face, and seems to set everything on fire. Once you get the belts upgrades for this thing, your 12.7s and 7.7s love setting fire to things. And also, on top of that, they do a lot of damage since the rate of fire on the guns is pretty high. It also carries a lot of ammunition compared to other Japanese planes, meaning that you can stay in the fight longer. This basically means that you aren't limited when you're flying Japanese. There is a lot of zeros that I fly which have that 120 shells of cannon ammo and then just the 7.7s, and it can be very annoying once you run out of that cannon ammo. You have to really conserve it, whereas in this plane you can at least miss a few shots and still get a lot of kills. It retains energy well enough to be able to stay in a sustained energy fight with anything it may come up against. This is something that I think a lot of people overlook. The fact that an energy fighter can actually be able to stay full of energy, not just in a boom and zoom environment. It can actually go in a straight line, use its acceleration to its advantage, and be able to get back up to a higher energy state while dogfighting. You contrast well with the Zero, creating an unstoppable pair of a turn fighter and an energy fighter. The Ki-61 is decent at mid-altitude and the Zero is good at low altitude. This basically means that if the Zero or the Ki-61 can bring people down, the Zero wins the battle, but if the Zero is in trouble with a turn fighter, then the Ki-61 can boom and zoom. It's a wonderful pair that the Japanese have there. But anyway, let's get on to the weaknesses. If you are caught at low energy, you are dead. This can basically be said about any energy fighting plane, but this thing does not do well when it is at low energy. It struggles to turn, it struggles to roll, it struggles to do basically everything supposedly a Japanese plane should do. The damage model is definitely bugged and needs reworking. As shown in the arcade section, well, let's just say the hitboxes are just slightly a bit too big for this plane. And also, when you get hit on one wing, sometimes it hits the other and everything like that. It's very odd when it comes to the damage model with this plane. Your engine is weak to anything it gets hit by and also loves the smell of burning. This engine, even though it's good at its job, it really loves just dying, as shown once again in arcade where that Ju-87 put a few 7.7 hits into me and, well, it turned red almost instantly. It cannot turn as well as you may think, so you may get stuck in situations you do not want to be in. Because it is a Japanese fighter, a lot of people will have basically an idea of how they're supposed to fly it, and with the Ki-61 you have to throw that out of the window, so that's something we have to look at. If an enemy plane gets an energy advantage against you, it is hard to negate it. This thing does not turn great, it does not roll that well, it doesn't really do anything like that very well because of its elevator, so basically when it comes down to negating energy and pulling maneuvers to try and lower the other guy's energy, it is tough to do. The really only way to be properly advantageous in this plane is to have a massive energy advantage. But overall, it's a fun plane. I mean, I'm not going to say it's bad, because the great thing about it is that a lot of pilots who face it think it's a turn fighter. So they try and fight it like a turn fighter, and you basically just destroy them through energy fighting. It's wonderful. And there's a lot of American players out there who struggle against this aircraft. But anyway, thank you for watching, and have a great day.